Quite a production. The unmasking, the illuminating the slides. Good morning. I'd like to reiterate Urvashi's thanks to the university sponsors and to RaceB4Race, ooh, bit of a ring, and express my thanks to Urvashi, Liza, and all of the local and international team that brought this together. I hope you all will indulge me if I go a little away from my prepared remarks, but I've set a timer so that I will still be respectful of time. I can't quite, after yesterday's, are you getting that ring? Yeah, okay. All right. Maybe it's too, let's see. All right. After yesterday's remarks, that's better. After yesterday's remarks, I can't quite give a traditional academic talk the way that I intended. Now, for one thing, the program is not correct, but the error was mine. I'm so used to writing Assistant Professor Miles Grier that I forgot that I am an associate professor now. Thank you, and many of you in the room contributed to that becoming a fact, so thank you. But it's given me a bit of a kind of retrospective, put me in a bit of a retrospective mood. So I've now completed a book called Inkface, and I thought I would explain a little bit to you about what that book is, and also talk about a more recent discovery of mine, which is that I'm not, though the word is my coinage, the earliest writers in the African American tradition, well, Black Atlantic, excuse me, had already clocked this aspect of white race making. And they've been cut off from our genealogies by a kind of historicism that insists that we, for example, cite the Atlantic Slave Voyages database if we want to understand what's happening historically in terms of race making, which of course places Africans as cargo. You know, to the extent that we existed, to the extent that we can show up in early modern studies, it's as something numerical rather than as thinking beings who understood exactly what was happening around us and intervened in that. So I was actually, you know, though I was a little frightened to find that Phyllis Wheatley and Adebayo Kugoano had already figured out what I happened upon, I was also heartened and encouraged to know that part of what I was doing was recovering a form of knowledge that had been, as I said, disavowed and cut off. And unfortunately, that effort to cut us off from that is ongoing. You know, there have been some recent polemical publications that have attempted to do that again. So I speak today in the name of the disavowed, those cut off from legitimacy, those denied a history. Okay, so with that, and this is also strange because I don't need this little stool, and so I'm having to straddle the podium here. So, okay. I think there's a metaphor there about my way of fitting into early modern studies. Okay, so, Inkface, am I okay? Oh, well, thank you. That's all I had to do. Thank you, Liza. So I will just briefly say, Inkface is a book that began with my recognition that early modern English drama tends to associate painted Moors with ink. So one example would be late in Othello when he is questioning Desdemona's fidelity to him, he says, "Was this fair paper, this most goodly book, made to write whore upon?" And I thought, well, where did the ink come from to do this writing? And then I found, with the help of Kim Hall and Matthew Chapman, Mr. Moore's Revels, which is an Oxford masque in which boys who are impersonating apes, it's a double impersonation, boys who are dressed as apes come in to impersonate Moors, and when the ape boys come in to ape the Moors, they first steal the Moors' black coats, and then they apply a coating from an inkhorn to their own faces. And I thought, okay, so we've got a double metaphor here. We've got ink as a coat, blackness as a coat, and then blackness as an ink. And I thought, well, what value does that have for the English at this moment of nascent empire? What moment does it have to keep playing with these very different understandings of blackness? One is, of course, removable. It's clothing, it's a status marker, potentially, it's a commodity. I'm thinking, of course, of Ian Smith's great work on textile blackness. But the other has a different genealogy. It's associated with stigma, which of course is the Greek word for this mark of the barbarian, mark of enslavability, and ink, unlike a coat, is indelible. So they're very different material understandings of race, and I suspect that the ability to move between those two is actually what's most helpful to the English at this moment. If we need it to be something removable, if we need to say that your people can be educated, then we say, it's just a coat. But if we need for the stigma that you bear to be permanent, then we go toward ink and we just revolve it. So that is Inkface. Now, in terms of my title, some of you will recognize it from Coriolanus. This is a moment when the mother and wife of the titular war hero, the mother and the wife of Coriolanus are returning from Rome's gates where they said tearful goodbyes to the exiled Coriolanus. Trudging home, they encounter the tribunes who inspired the banishment of Coriolanus. Conflict ensues. Volumnia says, "I would my son were in Arabia, and thy tribe before him, his good sword in his hand." One of the tribunes who inspired the banishment says, "What then?" The wife responds, "What then? He'd make an end of thy posterity." Volumnia concludes, "Bastards and all." So as I mentioned, today I speak in the name of a disowned field returned home. It first spoke its name as images of Moors in Renaissance drama or poetry. I'm thinking of Tocsin and Jones. It took interdisciplinary shape as race in early modern studies. I'm thinking of Peter Erickson and Kim Hall. Recently, Margot Hendricks, one of the founders, has rechristened it Premodern Critical Race Studies, which still kind of doesn't flow from my tongue too easily, though I know it's our name now. But by any name, this field began as a bastard field, disavowed by the paternal law of historicism, banished, if not from Rome, then from pre-modern European studies. To transgress against this law was to defy the philology of race, recited again and again. Race entered English from the Spanish, where it referred to a breed of horses. It referred to stock or lineage and did not take on the sense of phenotypically different human groups until the middle of the 18th century. Repeat ad nauseum. But as I think about this philological ban, I'm struck by the fact that we have allies, and I'm thinking specifically of Jeffrey Maston's new-ish book, Queer Philologies, where Maston notes the collusion of philology in the cultural imperatives that produce the illegitimate, the bastard. So he talks about some of the terms, and I just want to list them quickly. Matrices, Latin for wombs; etymologies, which is to translate the true origins, the genealogies of words, families of related language, the pursuit of linguistic roots, stemmata, that is the family of stems or trees or pedigrees of manuscripts and printed texts, lines of descent, contamination and corruption, fidelity or faithfulness of translations, the mongrelization of literary genres, and the spurious, illegitimate, false, bastard, adulterous words. Maston's catalog shows that philology borrows metaphors from the arena of sexuality and reproduction, carrying a eugenicist's vigilance into the cultural realm. We have the regulation of sexuality, evident in terms such as matrix fidelity, contamination, and a vigilant pruning of illegitimate stems, mongrels, and bastards. Now, even if these charged terms were suppressed, distinguishing a language from foreign importations is not an innocent pursuit. It is actually a very motivated disavowal. In the sexual world, the bastard is the product of a paternal disavowal, what Hortense Spillers famously calls a fatherly reprieve, one rarely offered to mothers, hence her title, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe. In the social world, contaminants enter through the offices of global trade. Foreign objects and persons enter the metropole, their presence indicating economic supremacy, but potentially undermining the cultural and biological purity of the nation's space. The branch of philology known as historical linguistics appeared in the 19th century, just as queer theorist Siobhan Somerville shows us that the homosexual body was being invented by employing techniques of comparative anatomy borrowed from scientific racism. Maston suggests that philologists operated within the framework of nationalism, which, as Etienne Balibar has argued, always entails establishing a race with a proper claim to national space. I just love this phrase. He says that actually racial nationalism is less about positing common ancestors as it is about ensuring common descendants. And so I would argue that that impulse is actually central to this kind of historical philologism that has tried and is unfortunately trying again to suppress the study of race by deeming it foreign, disavowed, bastard, and I would also say present. I mean, one of the objections is, why are we using critical race theory? You know, that is a methodology derived in the United States in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement to explain the persistence of racism in the United States, so therefore it cannot be applied. And one wonders, when those kinds of objections are made, why then we employ Marxism to study the past, or why we use Freud, or, there are plenty, or philology for that matter. So, I want to quickly talk a little bit about, I want to offer a quick retort to that and then move on. So we've seen in these recent essays that I've alluded to a return to actually a critique that was levied against Kim Hall when her book first appeared. And it is the argument that she has no historical evidence. This is Anthony Fletcher's infamous review, where he even gets her middle initial wrong. And what I find interesting is that what the argument was then and remains now is around whether we have an expansive definition of race, an expansive critical understanding of race, or a restricted one. And the somewhat akin in the United States to the strict constructionists of the Constitution. And what are the other ones called? Loose. We'll call them loose. Okay. So I think that's what they're called. I think loose constructionists and strict constructionists. So the argument is that the restricted understanding of race, the one where I said, well, it enters from the Spanish and it has this very, restricted understanding and it only changes in the 18th century, I think misunderstands what's going on in terms of race as an expert discourse versus race as a sort of folk technology. And as I confront the kind of accusation of being presentist, I think, okay, well, that's a kind of Marxist understanding that people's context shapes their consciousness. But then I wonder, well, how do those who are criticizing this work escape their present context? And I'm thinking specifically of why a restrictive definition of race, or excuse me, how that is actually a very presentist pursuit. So just a quick story. In 1976, the United States Supreme Court set overt discriminatory intent rather than disproportionate impact as the judicial standard in anti-discrimination cases. In 1976, the court, same year, the court upheld a higher scrutiny for anti-discrimination cases that cited the Constitution rather than the regulations of Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. You'll be unsurprised to hear that civil rights litigator Justice Thurgood Marshall dissented. Nevertheless, the court did require this proof of discriminatory intent. Though it did concede, because of his dissent, that proof of discriminatory intent could be found in disparate impact. In 1989, in the Reagan-Bush era, after a few choice appointments, in the Ward Cove case, the court's conservative majority increased the burdens on plaintiffs bringing discrimination suits to show proof positive of which specific policy led to the disparate racial impact, even in Title VII cases related to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Marshall, near the end of his career, dissented again. I find myself in Marshall's position when I argue against the kind of strict account of race coming from the biological sciences and being established there. But I do find, as I mentioned, that I'm not the first and I'm not alone. And again, many of the others, Patricia, Urvashi, are here today. So, turning back to try to reconnect, and I'm sorry, before I go here, let me just say, I found then that the goal of my new work is to try to locate the critical perspectives that we're employing in pre-modern critical race studies earlier. Because there's a sort of acceptance that, oh, well, yes, okay, Said, you get, Said, Toni Morrison, fine. By the 70s or the 80s, fine, but no earlier, right? So, here I find Phyllis Wheatley's famous On Being Brought from Africa to America, and the couplet that I've highlighted here. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train. Now, when I was first taught this poem, the question was, to what extent is Phyllis Wheatley still connected to her African roots? To what extent has she kind of been overwritten and brainwashed by Christianity? These were kind of the questions. But in light of my own work on Inkface, I find myself looking again at diabolic dye. What exactly is she pinpointing by saying, not, they say you're black. Like, that's not just, they say you're black, right? And black means evil. We have to think about the material properties of dye, whether that suggests that refinement, as she says, is possible or not. And I think the other thing that she really notes here by switching to the imperative, remember, Christians, is that part of what's really at stake is interpretive authority. Who gets to speak on what the text means? And that's one of the additional and crucial exclusions of white supremacy. It's not just you're good, you're bad, It's more, we have the authority to determine when you are good and when you are bad, and when it's removable and when it's possible to be refined. So, Wheatley is in my corner. I'd now like to no, I'm going to skip that one. I'd like to move ahead to Atabak Kugoano's exegesis of Jeremiah chapter 13, verse 23, and his thoughts and sentiments on the evil and wicked traffic of slavery. The scripture, of course, reads, "Can the Ethiopian change his skin or the leopard change his spots? Then may ye also do good that are accustomed to do evil." Kugoano concedes authority to the Christian God, but not to those who would have this passage from Jeremiah confirm blackness as a sign of obdurate sinfulness. He assumes the mantle of the schoolmaster, or indeed the catechist, speaking to his white British audience. Differences, he says, of a natural variety among the things themselves is in every respect equally innocent, and what they cannot alter or change was made to be so. So intended for the very purposes of instructive language to men. And by these extreme differences of color, and this is my favorite part, it was intended to point out and show to the white man that there is a sinful blackness in his own nature which he can no more change than the external blackness which he sees in another can be rendered otherwise. Both Wheatley and Kugoano grasped that the interpretive arena they entered had subjected them to what Miranda Fricker calls an epistemic injustice, that is, harm done to a person's capacity as a knower or their capacity to testify. So part of this is really what's at stake when we consider the attempt once again to snuff out and suppress early modern race studies or pre-modern critical race studies. I'm just about at my time. So what I want to do, I'm trying to keep my alarm from ringing and disturbing everyone. Okay, all right, okay, we'll cancel that. So what I want to do then, I'll say one final word, and then I will give us a couple of potential things to look at. So the final word, Michael Gomez, who spoke at, I think, the second Race4Race, has an excellent book called Exchanging Our Country Marks, where he talks about the transformation of Africans of different ethnicities, social strata, into what we now think of as the black race, and the ways in which the Middle Passage, seasoning on the American coast, et cetera, contributed to this reformation of identity. But of course, being the person that I am, I'm really drawn to that phrase, marks. And so what I'd like to do is think a bit with you about what it meant to posit, sorry, I'm going to have to toggle between two things, that African people, or indeed indigenous peoples of the Americas as well, were composed of or covered in ink, and what that meant in terms of what white people were amassing for themselves by making this particular projection. So let me bring two things together, and then I'll kind of close and let us talk about it together. So this is from Thomas Brown's Pseudodoxia Epidemica, and I have to thank Ian Smith, who always finds amazing things. So Brown is doing one of these kind of classic early modern, why are some people black? Takes him 6 chapters, is it the sun? Is it the blood? Is it this? Is it that? And in his final chapter, he says that the second way whereby bodies become black is by an atramentous condition or mixture. And his proposition here is that, I don't know, maybe they're just inky. That's what atramentous comes from. Atramentum scriptorum, as he says, has to do with writing ink. So there's something in the composition of black people he's thinking. This is a physician. Okay, so we're not just talking about somebody, with no kind of credentials. So this is his suspicion. He never, settles on any one of his explanations, but this is one that he trots out. And finally, this from Bulwer, who, much like Afra Ben in her Orinoco, is suggesting that, in this case, Africans, in the case of Thomas Harriot, it would be the indigenous people of Virginia, that they are sort of inheritors or successors to tattooed British people, the Picts. Sorry, my goodness gracious. Microphones. What's key here, besides the kind of overlay, the excess of ink on this African, I think, is that I like to think of it as sort of the tattoos on the woman who is a Pict, overwritten so much that they actually become the skin itself, right? And so it seems to me that what's really happening, well, I have my own thought. Some of you have read my work, so I'll quickly say one thing that I think is happening is that the stigma of enslavability is being transferred from the English to the colored peoples of the world, as Du Bois would say. And I would also quickly say that I think one of the other things that's happening is, to go back to Gomez, that marks that were used to express status or tribal affiliation, possibly even gender, are being overwritten by, like, the only thing that matters now is racial subordination, enslavability. So those are some of my thoughts. I'm curious if you have any other thoughts about these images or that quotation from Brown, or any additional evidence that you would bring to Marshall, or Marshall to, yeah, that you would marshal. Thurgood Marshall, okay. Whoa.
Becomes more complex itself, and the sort of individual lines of, oh, am I here now? The individual lines of the engravings seem to sort of have a more care to them, as opposed to this just
ink blot.
Ink blot, exactly. And so I was wondering if, and then of course we know later on, as we continue to represent things visually, photography has its own infamous history, and we kind of go backwards in a weird way. And so I was wondering if, as you're sort of looking at inking, and not just inking on the page, but a transition from kind of wood cutting to engraving, if there's different metaphors, or if you sort of see different representations of printing on the skin, of whether it be sort of tattoo-like, or if there's a way in which that the representation of engraved African bodies seem to be almost more tattooed because of the way that engraved lines have to create those shadows and darkness. I was just wondering if you, in your sort of studies, come across something like that, or if that begins to change the metaphors at all. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really an excellent question. I should never use images because I'm not a visual studies person. But sometimes they make a gross point that you're trying to make finer. So, I mean, I can certainly tell you that my friend Jonathan Senchen would be the person to answer that question. But I'm not particularly well versed in whether the metaphors change. But what I would say is this. Here's my intuition. My intuition is that if they did, there would be a sort of, you know, Said talks about a flexible positional superiority. So it's like, okay, well, if now we've got two kinds of blackness, you know, we've got shadow, we've got black skin and we've got shadow. It's like I would imagine that the kind of white supremacist imagination is going to play with either one of those in a way that, you know, as they say, the house always wins, right? So I don't have any sort of examples off the top of my head, but I think it's a very worthy question, and I'd love to read someone talking about it.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I really, really enjoyed your work, and I would like to ask about some of the different properties of ink, and particularly in your work, how have you seen an intersection with the creative properties of ink and the ability of ink to spread information or make something more valuable, to dye something and make it more beautiful? Has this factored into the sources that you're working with or the way that you're thinking about Inkface?
Another excellent question. Thank you. Okay, so that's another one where I go, I know who could answer that, and the answer is Ian Smith. You know, as well as Kim Hall, I mean, that's the kind of interesting conundrum that a lot of us, and you know, I'm reading Urvashi's book right now to review it. That'll come out in Modern Philology, my rave about Urvashi's book. There's a strange doubleness about both blackness and stigma. That they can, you know, elevate or they can denigrate. And so, you know, blackness is certainly, it can be, as a dye, a color of luxury, absolutely. But, of course, when it comes to the discourse of slavery, it's you know, a color of denigration. So I'm thinking, yeah, I mean, there'd have to be people who kind of play with that. You know, and of course, Kim Hall, you know, in the chapter in Things of Darkness about, you know, black people as in portraiture, you know, as this sort of doubled, you know, they may be draped in fine clothing, but they're only meant to kind of highlight the wealth of the white person. So, yeah, I mean, it's a complicated tangle. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello. Also wanted to thank you for the really powerful talk and the words you shared and how you were inspired by Dr. Cooper's talk yesterday. So the thing that I was particularly moved by was the interpretive moves you represented from Phyllis Wheatley and Audible Kugano. And the question I had is, this idea of whenever there's an opportunity, and even when there's not an opportunity in different ways, this denigrated notion of blackness that's imposed on black people in conditions of subjectivity or enslavement, they're always speaking back. And then, you know, if you even think of Michael Gomez's work, this goes back to Abbasid Iraq, when you have people writing back, et cetera, so like 1,000+ years. So I guess the question is, I feel like you identified in this space that I'm new to, has identified a problem in the disciplines and the training that we have, where to write that you have to almost provide all the evidence, and then after you provided the evidence, still convince people who are skeptical of the evidence that this is meaningful to all these fields. I'm a PhD student. What do we, like, other than spaces like this, what do we what do we do? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, because this is my first experience like this. It's like I find ones that are like nearby, and I'm like, okay, they're a little bit receptive, but they're still challenging this, and I'm like, well, the evidence is here. Your mind is blown, but mine's not. Like this is, I knew, you know. So what do we? I don't know. What do we do? I don't know if my question makes sense.
It's an excellent question. You stand firm.
Okay.
You stand firm, and you do the work. I mean, and when I say do the work, what I mean is, yes, you do the research, you amass the evidence. You know, I'm not saying you can just go, oh, well, any criticism of me is racist, you know, or something like that, you know. But you do the work while understanding that there's a community, and this is only a sliver of it, that there are people who are waiting for this work. You do it understanding that there is a tradition that if you, I mean, I'll say this quickly. The only reason that I know about Wheatley and Cugoano, I wouldn't know this as an early modernist. I would not. I know it because when I worked with my friend Andrea Walkden at Queens College, I had the privilege, though it sometimes felt like a burden, of teaching widely. And so I was teaching an early Black Atlantic course, and I was just frustrated, you know, with like, oh, well, you know, students expect to hear something about, you know, how bad slavery was, and they think that's the point of every paper. And I thought, gosh, is there a way for me to turn this early Black Atlantic course into a kind of early Black intellectual history? Can I do that? And if so, you know, if the audience, if the point of that tradition and the point of that literature is no longer to inform white people about how bad slavery is. I'm like, white people know how bad slavery is. They all knew it. So if that's not the point, you know, if the point is to record an intellectual tradition and to go back to your question about information, you know, to spread that. I mean, so many of these people, be it, you know, Wheatley or Douglas or David Walker, you know, David Walker owned a printing press, right? You know, so people understand exactly, you know, the discourse that they're entering. But what's most fascinating to me is that they're not just documenting the evils of slavery. They are clocking how white supremacy works as an epistemic project and reminding each other not to be. So I'll just say one last quick thing because it's my favorite little anecdote. You know, we all, I'm sorry, I forget, I'm not in the United States. Many of us know, many of us know, you know, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass and his conflict with the slave breaker Covey. It's this huge, you know, masculine battle they have, and, you know, Douglass manages to break the slave breaker. In My Bondage and My Freedom, which is an expanded version of Douglass's autobiography, he talks about an encounter he had with, you know, what we might call an herb man, a conjurer. And, you know, he's run off, Douglass has run off, and the conjurer says, "Why'd you run off?" And he says, "This white man keeps beating me." And the conjurer says, "Take that herb that you see right on the ground there and put it in your right pocket and he'll leave you alone." And Douglass writes to us, "You know, I was the most learned Negro in Maryland at that point, and that sounded like nonsense to me." And Sandy says to him, "Have those books kept you from getting your ass beat?" You know, and it's like, and I'm not against book learning. I'm not trying to disavow, you know, I mean, I told you all, associate professor, right? You know, so I'm not trying to disavow that. But what I know is that the book discourse, right, is also, it should be, as Dr. Cooper said last night, a prompt for our imagination about what's being excluded and deauthorized. You know, and so I love that Douglass actually includes, like, he doesn't just build on his own most learned Negro in Baltimore thing. He includes in it, and he says, "So I put it in my pocket," right? I mean, you know, and he left me alone for 2 weeks, right? You know? So Douglass also understood that it's not about just sort of amassing a kind of respectable standing as a learned Negro. You know, there are allegiances that are deeper than that are centuries old, and that are informing what we do. And so you stand on that, but you learn about it. I mean, I wouldn't have known. So, sorry, long answer.
So I'm going to have to apologize. I'm trying to pull a question out of a half-baked thought, but this is kind of serendipitous because tomorrow I'm talking about Robert Howard's representation of the Picts. And I think you've just given me a couple hours of last-minute edits to my paper that I'll have to make after this. So one of the interesting things about the tattoos is this has always been sort of the British idea of the Picts, is that they have these tattoos made from woad. There have been a lot of attempts to recreate that process, mostly on the part of people who do living history, and it always fails. It's toxic. The skin won't hold it. So there's basically, you get an infection and then the ink goes away if you try to reproduce this process. That's something that I'm thinking about looking at this, but I've only had maybe 10 minutes to think about it, so I don't really have a question here. Except that it does, the mythology of paintedness or tattooedness from which we get the name the Picts appears to be, I think the phrase you used was mark of barbarism, and very little else. So it's interesting here to see that transferred, as you said.
Yeah, Carolyn Sale has an excellent essay on Titus Andronicus, in which she argues that the Moor Aaron is, I mean, I don't agree with this conclusion, but it's a fascinating one, and the evidence that she amassed in reaching the conclusion was really informative to me. She talks about ancient Britons and sort of using more of kind of like a war paint, you know, and this painting was done to scare the enemies, and that this painting may have been done in advance of Roman invasion, you know. And so she argues that in Titus Andronicus, where Aaron is the enemy of the Roman, you know, Republic, that the English might have, that Shakespeare might have wanted the English to actually identify with Aaron as a kind of reincarnation of the Picts. And the idea is that, she says, that Britain was about to impose on native peoples of the Americas the same things that the Romans had imposed upon them, and that Titus Andronicus was meant, you know, as a warning. That part I'm not convinced about, but, I mean, what a journey getting to that conclusion. You know, it's kind of the stuff she was able to amass is just really remarkable. And it really winds up being, and this goes back to your question, about the history of literacy. You know, that she's saying that this move, and this goes back to this question as well, that this move to say that legitimate knowledge and legitimate communication are found in the book and not on the body. You know, like that's part of what the bookish discourse is, right? Is that, of course, there are signs everywhere. There's, you know, I mean, this is Juliet Fleming's work or Gray Gundaker's work. There are signs on the walls. There are signs, you know, there are signs people, you know, there aren't an illiterate people in terms of a people that don't make signs. But what happens in early modernity is one particular way of signing becomes archivable, you know, and authoritative, and then the rest get, if not erased, then demoted, right? So that's just a bit of a riff in response to, but I can't wait to hear what you have to say tomorrow.
Thank you so much for that astonishing paper, as ever. It was just extraordinary. And I have just two really, really quick questions, and then I'll probably try and grab you in the break to keep asking more. And they're actually connected because I'm thinking about the way in which Wheatley also talks about Terence, right? One alone of Afro-Sable race, right? And then that wonderful footnote, he was an African, right? But I wonder if you could say, I wonder if I could invite you to do just a little bit more about interpretive community and the way in which, of course, part of your just astonishing argument here and elsewhere is about who gets to wield the epistemic authority to read the body. And I'm wondering, as I'm looking at these images, about the interpretability of the ink in particular cases, whether there's a particular difference, so not just the interpretive community that gets precisely to render the body legible in these instances, but also how available particular bodies are, and maybe even in these two cases, these different bodies are to that kind of active interpretation, and whether you could sort of say more about the sort of legibility, the knowability of these different kinds of bodies, and particularly then if we're distinguishing between, say, the different modes of bodies present and past that you're thinking about.
Oh my, okay, all right. Well, it's a good thing we have an ongoing conversation because there's no way I'm going to be able to answer that right now, but as a way of just starting, I'll say two things. With Terence, part of what I find kind of interesting there is that it's not just that Wheatley is, establishing this ancestor. Some of you might know that in Timaeus, Wheatley says, something like, why to only one of Afric-Sable race this partial grace, right? So it's her way of announcing, but it's her way of announcing, I belong here. So we tend to hear that Wheatley was sort of, nervous and apologized, and we read her, oh, I wrote these in a few hours, and, I was just pressured by other people to, well, Afra Ben says the same thing, and Thomas Jefferson actually says the same thing before Notes on the State of Virginia. So, like, this modesty, is not legit. She's like, and not only do I know I belong here, but I know there's been, like, a major canonical one before me. But the other thing I would quickly say is, some of her poems, I think it's to S.M., a painter, some of her poems are actually directed to other Africans, right? So there isn't this idea that it's always her, like, begging to be taken seriously by white people, right? So that's just a little thought about Terence. And I think the only thing I'll say now about interpretive community is another kind of quick reference to Michael Gomez. I think that what focusing on ink and tattooing allows us to do is to really see a kind of social engineering taking place on the part of the English. That they're encountering peoples in the New World and on the African coast who have a social order. I'm not necessarily saying it's always, I'm not trying to romanticize it, that social order, but they have a social order. They have clans, they have ranks, they have judiciary systems, they have scriptures, they have, they have all of those things. And what the slave system does, what you have to do is you have to break that. And you have to say, well, I don't know what that mark on you means, right? I just know you're covered in a lot of them, and that makes you black and enslavable, right? Like, so it has to be, it's sort of, I guess maybe what I'd say is, it's really competing literacies being pitted against each other. Saying you have one, that determines authority in your community and that sets social rank and that determines who can reproduce with whom and who, it determines all those things. And we're now going to overwrite that with, I'm trying not to say white over black, but I'll just say white over black. Sometimes old school is the way to kick it.
thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you for that fascinating talk. Please join me in thanking Miles for that just brilliant.